morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Michaela Vrazdova, and I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. So today we are going to spend some time and we will talk about the TN visa. This webinar will go over the TN visa requirements, and we will discuss whether a sponsorship is needed for the TN visa. So a few things before we get started. So Scott Legal is a full-service immigration law firm, and we assist individuals pursuing various types of visas and green cards. And we do regularly process a high number of TN visas for Canadian and Mexican nationals. So we will continue to have this webinar series, and we will have at least 2 webinars a month on different visa topics. So please sign up for future webinars on our website. At the end of this webinar, we will send you out a few things. So we will send you the PowerPoint we will be using during this webinar. We will also send you our TN visa guide, which is a comprehensive visa guide that goes over the TN visa for additional webinars we will have in the future, and also a link where this webinar will be recorded. So finally, this webinar will be made available on YouTube, and we encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button on our YouTube channel, as we often post new immigration videos. And finally, we will send you a link where you can set up a consultation with one of our attorneys, and you can discuss your particular visa situation. So regarding speakers, we are lucky to have Dustin Saldarriaga, who is a senior associate at the firm and who has a lot of experience processing TN visas. And as I mentioned, my name is Michaela Vrazdova, and I will be the moderator of today's webinar. And finally, one final comment before we get started. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and we will get to all questions at the end of the webinar. Perfect, Dustin. So why don't we get started?
All right, thank you very much, Michaela, and thank you all for joining us today for our TN presentation. The TN really is one of the most common options that we handle at our firm, and it makes sense because if you're a national of Canada or Mexico and you have a job offer in the US, there are really few better options to come to the US and work for an employer. The TN's fast, it's straightforward, relatively simple, and as we'll discuss today, it places pretty minimal requirements on the employer. So let's talk about the requirements to qualify for a TN visa. You must be a national of Canada or Mexico, meaning you need to hold a passport from one of those 2 countries. You must be coming to the US to work in a profession that appears on the list of professions that's in the TN regulations. And when I say TN regulations, I am talking about a specific law, and it may be helpful for you all to have that in front of you. If you actually want to look at that law, I'll be referring to it throughout the presentation. Just go to Google and Google TN NAFTA, NAFTA regulations, and the first link that comes up, if you click on it, it's the actual law. And if you scroll down, you'll see that there are a list of several dozen professions, starting with accountant, architect, computer systems analyst. These are the professions that I'm referring to. So you need to be coming to the US to work in one of these listed professions. You must have the required qualifications to practice that profession. So again, to figure out what that is, you'd look at the TN regulations, and it actually lists what the qualification is. So if you look at accountant, which is the first profession on the list, you'll see it requires a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree, or one of several credentials, CPA, CA, CGA, or CMA. So there's no way around this requirement. If you're an accountant and you want to come to the US, you need to satisfy one of these 2 requirements. You either need the degree or you need the license. And the qualifications are different for each profession. If you look at architect below, they will take a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree or a state or provincial license. And then for a computer systems analyst, the third profession on the list, you see it's again different. They will accept a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree or a post-secondary diploma or post-secondary certificate and experience. So again, you need to first define your profession, what you're coming to the US to practice, and then you'll look at the qualifications to make sure that you meet those qualifications. The fourth requirement is you must have a pre-arranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the US. So you do actually need to have that job offer. It cannot be the TN visa is not intended for you to come to the US and at that point to look for a job. And part of the application, we'll talk about this more a bit later in the presentation, you will actually need a letter from that employer that explains the specific terms of the employment, your job duties, etc. So you do need that job offer actually on the table before you apply for the TN. And in the job, you need to be employed to engage in the professional activities that are consistent with the listed profession. So in other words, it's not enough to simply say, I'm coming to the US to work as an accountant, and then to say work in job duties that look more like marketing. You actually need to come to the US and perform the job duties that the US government thinks an accountant will do. And so how do you figure that out? What does the government think an accountant does? The second very helpful website, in addition to the NAFTA regulations, the second very helpful website is called the Occupational Outlook Handbook. This is a website that's published by the US Department of Labor. And I do recommend, again, if you're at your computer actually pulling it up now, go to Google, type in Occupational Outlook Handbook or OOH, and let's just put in accountant as a test. So if you click on the link, you see accountants and auditors, and then at the on the tabs, you'll see a tab that says what they do. If you click on that, you actually see a list of job duties. These are the job duties that the US government thinks that an accountant should do. So going back to this fifth requirement that you see on the PowerPoint, you want to make sure that if you're applying to be an accountant on a TN visa, you want to make sure that your job duties are aligned with what are listed here on the OOH website. Examine financial statements, compute taxes, inspect account books, organize and maintain financial records, etc. Now, you don't need to be doing these job duties verbatim. You wouldn't want to copy and paste this into your TN application, but you do want to make sure that the job duties that you're coming to the US to do and that your employer understands that you'll be doing really are aligned with these job duties. So Michaela, we can go to the next slide. So what is sponsorship? This is a very common question in the context of a TN visa because, and especially from employers, because employers oftentimes have in mind that, if they're going to hire someone on a TN visa, that they have some, serious responsibilities as they would if the person were, for example, coming to work on an H-1B visa. And that is not the case. A TN visa has far fewer and less restrictive requirements than does, say, an H-1B, and certainly than employment-based sponsorship for a green card. So when you're talking about the H-1B context, let's start with that. The H-1B, and this is not the TN, this is the H-1B, would require, for example, that the employer pay a prevailing wage, which is higher than minimum wage and is the standard wage paid to people in your profession. The employer also cannot bench you. So in other words, you can't come to the US and then not work. They actually have to actively have you work and actually pay you. If you're terminated, they may need to pay for you to return to the US. They also would need to test the labor market and make sure that there are no competing US workers who are available. So the TN doesn't have any of those requirements. Basically, the TN, you do not need to pay a prevailing wage. You only need to make sure that you're paying above minimum wage, which you need to do for all of your employees. There's no obligation that you pay for return transportation if your employment ends. You don't need to test the labor market to see if there's a competing U.S. worker. You only really need to make that offer to the national of Canada or Mexico, and then they would put forward the application, and would simply bring the letter from you as the employer that lists out the details of the pay rate, the hours that you're expected to work, what your job duties will be. But that employer letter is not a binding contract. It is not a binding contract as, for example, it would be if you were pursuing an H-1B and you're actually attesting as the employer to what you will pay, to the hours, etc. The government is not going to make sure that you've complied 100% with the employer letter. They're typically not going to do an audit. The employee really is at will. So, the employer letter is what you intend to do as an employer. It should be honest, but it is not, going to be enforced by the U.S. government. Very much in contrast to, say, an H-1B or an employment-based green card. Now, what I've just described is there is an exception if the employee is within the US and is applying for a change of status to TN status from within the US. And to do that, they would apply with USCIS. We'll talk more about the application process, but for now, I just quickly want to say that if the employee is applying with USCIS from within the US, then the employer would technically file the application and they would sign the application. Their responsibilities are really no different, but it is important to just know that the employer would sign and submit the application. And if there is a denial of the application, it is technically the employer who would be denied. If, in contrast, the employee is outside the US and is applying either for a visa, a TN visa at a consulate, or is a Canadian applying at a port of entry, then the employer, all they have to do is provide the employment letter that I described before that details the terms of the employment. And if the applicant, the employee, is denied at the port of entry, then the employee receives the denial rather than the employer. So, really, I think the takeaway here to respond to the question of sponsorship, the answer is that no, the TN visa does not require sponsorship, certainly in the way that sponsorship is understood in the H-1B or green card context. So let's go ahead. Differences for Canadian and Mexican nationals. I've already touched on this a little bit, but essentially Canadians and Mexicans are treated differently in the application process for a TN visa. Canadians, let's start with nationals of Mexico. Nationals of Mexico must have a TN visa before they enter the US. So in order to get a TN visa, they must apply at a consulate abroad. And their application packet would look the same as for a Canadian. There's really no difference in the materials they need to submit. The difference is that Mexican nationals must apply at a consulate. They cannot apply at a port of entry as Canadians can. So Canadians have the luxury of being able to apply for a TN visa at a port of entry, whether that's a land crossing or an airport. They would simply bring their application packet, and we'll talk about what's included in that in a few minutes. They'd bring that with them to the airport or the land crossing. They'd present it, and they would answer whatever questions the border officer has. And when they're admitted into the US, they would be granted TN status. So very simple, especially simple process for Canadians. Even for Mexican nationals, the process is easy. TN visas are not burdensome applications. But they do need to go to a consulate. They cannot apply at an airport or a border crossing. They need to already have that visa. Now, Canadians can receive a TN visa or TN status for 3 years, up to 3 years. If the Canadian is married, the spouse can receive what's called TD status, which is essentially TN dependent status. That would give them the ability to live and study in the US, but not to work in the US. TD status does not give authorization to work. If the spouse is not a national of Canada, they would need to go to a consulate to get the TD visa. However, if the spouse is a national of Canada, then they can show up at the border or at the airport with the TN principal spouse. Now, nationals of Mexico, the spouse can also get a TD visa. Again, it allows you to live and work and study in the US, not to work. They would have to get that at the consulate. And a recent benefit for nationals of Mexico is that nationals of Mexico can actually get the TN visa for up to 4 years now, which is a huge benefit. In the past, it was issued for less than that, actually for 1 year, and now it's up to 4 if you're willing to pay an additional fee, which most people are, and it tends to be worth it. When you enter the US, nationals of Canada or Mexico can be issued TN status for up to 3 years. So just to quickly go over that, there's a difference between the visa validity period and the period of status. So let's say you're a national of Mexico, you've been given a TN visa for 4 years. When you enter the US, you're given an I-94, which defines how long you can stay in the US for. And typically that's granted for up to 3 years. You do need to leave the US before your I-94 expires, regardless of when your visa expires. And finally, in certain cases, renewals for nationals of Mexico can be done through the mail. Typically, the consulate will let you know if you qualify for that, so you need to apply first. So there are certain categories of the TN visa that are particularly challenging. The two that we'll talk about today, and really the two most challenging categories, are management consultants and economists. And they're challenging for different reasons. Management consultants, this category is challenging because management consultants, this is one of the only professions that does not have an education requirement. If you pull up your TN regulations and you go down to management consultant, you will see that a management consultant can qualify for a TN visa with either a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree or equivalent professional experience that's either as a management consultant or in a field of specialty that's related to the consulting agreement. So that second part, the 5 years of experience in a field of specialty related to the consulting agreement, opens up a huge door. And I'll present an example in a moment, but essentially all other professions, with very few exceptions, do require some kind of educational background. And so if you are a national of Canada or Mexico and you did not go to university, you do not have a post-secondary diploma or certificate, then one of the only categories you can apply for is management consultant. So the government sees a lot of people falling into this category as a catch-all. And as a result, they scrutinize applications that fall in the management consulting category. Now, real quickly, the level of risk runs along a spectrum. If you're applying in the management consulting category to work for a management consulting firm, such as McKinsey, Bain, BCG, or one of the many other consulting firms, that is not a high-risk application. Generally, those applications are the same risk as any other TN application. Where this category gets risky is if you are applying to come into the US as a management consultant to work for a company that is not a management consulting firm. So let's talk about an example. Let's say that you are a national of Canada and you are considered an expert in the production of solar panels. And you've received an offer from a US company that wants you to come to the US and work for them for let's say 3 years to help them design and improve their manufacturing and their sales of solar panels. So that would be, and let's say that you don't have a college degree. So that would be considered a high risk application for several reasons. First is that you're coming to work for a company that's not a management consulting company. It's a solar panel company. The second is that you're applying based on experience. You don't have a college degree, so you would have to apply based on your 5 years of experience in the field of specialty related to the consulting agreement. And in this case, the field of specialty would be solar panels, the production and sale of solar panels. So what do you need to do to reduce the level of risk? I'll start by saying you can't fully eliminate the risk. This is innately a risky area of TN visas just because, again, the government scrutinizes these applications. But things that you can do to strengthen the application are to really make it clear that you are coming to the US to really work as a management consultant and not to fill a permanent role at the company. The word that the government uses for this is that the position must be supernumerary. And it makes sense when you think about this in practice. When a company hires a management consultant, the management consultant usually comes in from an outside company and looks at what's happening at the company. They address a very specific challenge. They make recommendations to management on a very specific challenge, and then they leave. They're not there for 3 years. They're addressing a problem, and then they're out of the picture. And presumably the company will implement the recommendations. That's what the engagement really should look like. So if we go back to our solar panel engagement, ideally what that application would show is that this management consultant, this person coming into the US, the National of Canada, will be here for a temporary period of time. Ideally, it would not be 3 years. It would be a year, maybe at most 2 years. Also, there would be a consulting agreement that would make it very clear that this person is coming to the US to address a very specific problem at the US employer's company. So it could be that, this US employer is really struggling to reach a broader market. It could be that they really are experiencing high costs in the manufacture of their solar panels, and they need someone to come in and advise them on that. So you want to very specifically define the challenge that the US company is facing, that this foreign national is going to come to the US and address while in the US as a TN management consultant. You also want to show that the engagement really does look like what a management consultant would typically do. So salary, for example, typically suggests a permanent role at the company. So you want to avoid that. You want to show that you will be paid as a management consultant based on some kind of an agreement where you are paid basically based on the outcome, based on the product you are providing, but something other than salary. So hopefully you're starting to see how you really, the more that the engagement can look like a typical management consultant engagement, the higher likelihood that this application will be approved. The other thing I will say, you do want to show why this person really is the ideal person to come to the US and advise the company to address this challenge. So you can see how, management consultant is a challenging category, but frankly, we do see a lot of approvals in this category if you are really thoughtful and deliberate about it. And I'll also say, this is an area, if you're thinking about coming to the US, either as a management consultant or an economist, these really are categories where an attorney really can make a very substantial difference in the quality of the application and the odds of it getting approved. The second category that's especially risky is the economist category. So the reason is different. The economist category is risky because in 2017, the government issued a policy memo that basically said that the scope of who qualifies as an economist needs to be narrowed. Before 2017, people were coming to the US in the economist category to really work more in marketing and also really to focus on financial analysis, which is defined by the government as helping companies to find opportunities to make profits, often through investments. So those categories in particular were targeted and were said, those are not those do not fall within the economist category. So if you are coming to the US to work as an economist, what do you need to do? The first thing you need to do is look at the TN regulations. An economist can qualify through a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree. There is no experience option, so you really do need that degree, and it should be in economics, or it should be very closely related to economics. And how do you show it's closely related? Well, let's say your undergraduate degree is in math, and you took, as part of your math curriculum, extensive classes on econometrics, on subjects like that. That could be fine. You would want to include in your application your transcript, and you'd actually want to go through and highlight, all of your economics courses. If you wrote a thesis on an economics related course, you'd want to do that. But that's really the first step, is showing that you meet that benchmark requirement. The second thing you'd want to do is go to the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So we'll Google it now, OOH Economist. Click on that link and click what they do. And you'll see a list of those job duties that the government thinks that economists do. So again, what economists don't do in the eyes of the government are really work as, marketing analysts, as financial analysts. What they do is they research economic issues related to education, the labor force, international trade. They conduct surveys, collect data, analyze data using mathematical models and statistical tools. They interpret and forecast trends of financial markets. They advise, they present their research, so all of these things, and you can keep reading the page on the OOH website for economists. All of these things, that's what you want to focus on as your job duties at the company when you come to the US. And you do want to have a conversation with your employer before you apply to make sure that they really do intend for you to do the job duties that are listed on the OOH website. I'll quickly add one of the services that we frequently offer when we have a client who's applying as either a management consultant or an economist. We do oftentimes work both with the employee, the prospective TN applicant, as well as the employer. And that can oftentimes be helpful just to get everyone on the same page in terms of what needs to be in the employer letter, what needs to be described as part of the job duties, etc. So I already talked about the application process, but let's just go through this slide here and make sure we touch on all the differences between the process as it applies to Canadian nationals and nationals of Mexico. So Canadians can apply at ports of entry, at any port of entry, although it is recommended that you call beforehand just to make sure that the port of entry doesn't have any unique procedures. During COVID, some had limited hours, some would want you to use a specific entrance, so just call ahead of time if you're planning to show up on a certain date. So you would provide, if you're applying at a port of entry, you would provide the job offer letter and supporting documentation evidencing proof of citizenship, as well as your educational and professional qualifications. So let's take that and talk more broadly. The application packet, as I said before, is really going to be the same for nationals of Mexico or Canada. And what it looks like is, you really are just providing documentation that shows that you satisfy all of the aspects of the TN application. So the first, if you recall, is that you're a citizen of Canada or Mexico. So of course you would need your passport from Canada or Mexico. You'd also need to show that you meet the education or experience qualifications. So if you're applying as an economist, which requires a degree, you do need to bring your original diploma. Okay, If you're applying based on a related degree, like we talked about before, bring your original diploma and the original transcripts or a certified copy of your transcripts. If you're applying based on experience, you want to have letters from your past employers with the original signatures on the original, official letterhead for your past employers that talks about how you have, whether it's 3 years of experience or 5 years of experience doing work in that profession. So that's the qualification component. And then you want to have a letter from your prospective US employer that is on their letterhead, that has an original signature, where they are talking through a few things. The first thing that you'll want to include in the employer letter is details about the employer, who they are, their revenue, proving really that they can pay you, and that they have a legitimate need for someone in your profession. You'll also want to describe your background, how you qualify for the TN visa, again, through your educational background or your professional experience. Then you'd want to talk about the role that you'll have at the US company, your specific job duties, how many hours you'll be working each week, what your compensation will be. And then finally, the employer will kind of make an explicit request in the letter. Please approve this employee for a period of 3 years to work in the category of economist, in the economist category. So that's broadly speaking what the employer letter would include. And again, because border officers and consular officers encounter a lot of fraud in their day-to-day work, they are very picky about documentation. So plan to bring original documents, plan to bring documents with original signatures and printed on company letterhead, because otherwise you really are facing a risk that the documentation will be rejected, and you don't want to waste your time by not bringing the original documents. So going back to the slide, let me quickly add, what I just described is the packet if you are applying at a consulate or if you are applying at a port of entry as a Canadian national. If you're inside the US and you're applying through USCIS, you would submit, or your employer would submit, the packet I just described without original documents. So they can provide copies to USCIS. But in addition, they would provide what's called an I-129 form. And that's just a form that, it's a USCIS form that talks about who you are, your passport number, what you're going to be doing at the company, etc. It's a pretty straightforward form. So sorry, Michaela, I'm going to touch on a few more points. So going back to the slide, so nationals of Canada, going back to this third point, some ports of entry are optimized for faster TN processing. So if you are a first-time TN applicant, it can be helpful to apply at one of these optimized ports of entry. I believe these appear on the Customs and Border Protection CBP website. Or you can call the port of entry ahead of time to see whether they are optimized for a first-time applicant. Now, nationals of Mexico, those applying at a consulate, nationals of Mexico must apply at a consulate. To do that, you would file the DS-160 form, which is an online form. You would pay a visa application fee, you'd schedule your biometrics, do your fingerprints, you'd schedule your appointment, and then you would attend your TN interview. The interview is usually pretty straightforward, just asking you about your qualifications, what you're going to be doing in the US, maybe a little bit about the US employer. And finally, renewal applicants, as I mentioned before, may be eligible to apply by mail, but you'll need to submit the DS-160 and wait to see if the consulate actually waives your interview. And as I mentioned, those applying from within the US, whether they are nationals of Mexico or Canada, would file the application packet with USCIS along with the form I-129 and the application fee. All right. So some quick tips. As I mentioned, call ahead at the port of entry if you're a national of Canada, and just make sure you're familiar with the procedures and if they have any unique requirements. Make sure that the person who signed the employer letter knows when you will be approaching the border or going to the consulate. Reason being that some border officers and some consular officers will actually call the person who signed the employer letter just to make sure that the offer is legitimate. So, just give your employer a heads up. I'm going to be entering the US or applying tomorrow between, 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. If you could just have your phone on you, you might get a call. And again, bring the original diploma, official certified transcripts, and the original signed version of the employer letter. And finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. So what that means is that it's not a green card. You do need to have the intention of leaving the US at the end of your TN status. So do be prepared to show that you do have ties to your home country. Usually this is not an issue for those who are applying for the first time or even the second time, but once you're applying for a TN visa the third, fourth, fifth time, you might be asked questions about your intention to return to either Canada or Mexico at the end of your status. So, be prepared to show things like family ties, copies of bank account statements that you have a bank account in the foreign country, whatever other ties you have to the foreign country. Maybe you own a home, maybe you have an apartment, whatever that is. Okay, and Michaela, I think we can turn to questions.
Yeah, we have one question, Dustin. So someone is asking whether a licensed and practicing Canadian attorney can be hired in the US under the lawyer category to basically, practice on one of these positions, such as legal contract manager or compliance manager. Whether this person could qualify under the TN lawyer category.
Right, that's a great question. So it sounds like you meet the education qualification, so that wouldn't be an issue. So really the issue here is the job duties. So what you'd want to do is you would want to go to the Occupational Outlook Handbook, and you would want to look at the job duties that the government says that a lawyer should be doing. And as long as in your role in the US, the title is not controlling. What is controlling is the job duties. So, it's fine to be legal contracts manager, it's fine to be compliance manager, procurement manager, as long as your job duties are consistent with what is listed in the Occupational Outlook Handbook for what a lawyer does. I do tend to like it when a client's job title is the same or similar to what the TN regulations have, just because border officials, it's easier for them to see the title and say, oh, okay, versus seeing procurement manager and then saying, well, but is that a lawyer? It's just a hurdle that you remove, but usually it shouldn't be a problem.
Perfect. Then we have another question, and someone is asking whether a TN employee or a TN worker can be hired as a 1099 contractor, or whether there is a requirement that TN workers are W-2 salaried employees.
Yeah, that's a really good question. There is no requirement that the person be a W-2 employee. And, for the management consulting category, in fact, it's oftentimes better for them not to be a W-2 employee, just because, again, you want to show that you're not filling a permanent salaried position. So you can be an independent contractor, a 1099 worker. And then can you work 2 days a week? The answer is yes. TN does allow part-time work. You do, and in fact, you can work for multiple TN employers, both of them part-time, or for one employer part-time. So that's not a problem.
Perfect. The next question is, if someone has an active I-130 petition under the F4 category, does that affect the TN visa in any way?
It definitely could, because the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. So whenever you have a pending green card application, whether it's family-based or employment-based, the consulate or the border officer or USCIS, if you're extending or changing status, they could all ask about your intention to depart the US at the end of your status. So you need to anticipate those questions. Now that being said, it's not conclusive. So if, a brother F4 petition, that is probably taking years before you're going to see movement on that. So, what you would want to do in your application is make it very clear that you do need to leave the U.S. and you will leave the U.S. before you pursue that green card. So ways to do that are to choose consular processing on the family-based green card so that you actually need to leave the US before you apply for the green card, or actually receive the green card. And other ways are to say, an F4 petition right now, you applied 2 years ago and you have to wait 12 years or more for that petition to become current. So therefore you absolutely will be leaving the US in the meantime. So the answer is yes, it could affect the application, but there are ways to anticipate that. This is an area where it can be helpful to work with a lawyer just to look at possible pitfalls in the application.
Perfect. Thank you, Dustin. And then we have a last question. Someone is asking whether if you are in the US on TN status, can you start your own company, your own business, and work for that company?
Yes, that's a great question. The answer is yes, but be careful. So basically, there's no prohibition to passive investments and passive ownership of a business. So, if you're in TN status and you start an LLC and you get an office lease and you hire a US citizen to work for that company and do the day-to-day work, and really you have no day-to-day involvement in the business. You simply sit back and that business has retained earnings, then that's likely not going to be a problem. The other thing, but as soon as you become actively involved in that business, it does become a problem, because what you can't do on a TN visa is work outside of your work authorization. And on a TN, your work authorization is limited to your US employer that applied for the TN visa. So, as soon as you start doing things that look like work, you increase your risk of having problems with the government. So you want to make it very clear that you have no active role in the US business. Now, what we see a lot, because we handle a lot of E2 visa applications, is, someone might be in the US on a TN visa and might want to pursue an E2 visa to start their own business. So what you can do while you're in TN status, you can take steps to set up the business. Start the LLC, get an office space, maybe hire a worker, get whatever licenses you need for the business, but not start generating revenue. And you can file an application with, say, the consulate in Toronto or the consulate in Mexico, and go in for that E2 visa interview, get the visa, and come in. And once you come in, start actively running the business in E2 status. So that is something we see as well. But just be careful that you don't cross that line from truly passive, uninvolved, engagement to active engagement with the business, because you really don't want to engage in unauthorized work.
And we have one follow-up question on this. And I think the question is can you start a company in the US and then you own that company 100%, and can that company sponsor you for a TN visa, and you will then come to the US as an employee of that company on a TN visa?
The answer is no. So the TN visa, you cannot own the U.S. entity that employs you in TN status. But what you can do is own the foreign entity. So in case it's helpful in answering this question, and as you plan, um, for example, in the management consulting category, one thing you can do if you're a national of Canada, you can set up your own Canadian company, management consulting company. You can be the sole employee of that Canadian company, and then the US company can essentially contract with your Canadian company, and you can come into the US and provide services for the US company, which can pay your Canadian company. That is an arrangement. So, ownership of the business is not prohibited if the business is a foreign business. What is prohibited is you can't own the US business that employs you.
Perfect. And we have one last question. And the question is, so if a Canadian or a Mexican national, like once you apply for either a TN visa or at a port of entry, do you have to come to the US kind of like immediately to start working for the US company, or can you apply and once you see that it has been approved, can you go back to either Canada, Mexico, like wrap up your affairs and then come to the US?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And Michaela, honestly, I'd be curious to hear what your experience has been. I mean, my general recommendation is not to not to enter more than 10 days before you're starting employment. So, if the employer says we want you to start on July 1st, don't try to enter earlier than June 20th, June 21st. My general recommendation is that you shouldn't try to enter before you're actually planning to work. I just think it's not worth running the risk of being denied entry. But I'm curious to hear what your experience has been, Michaela.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it will kind of depend on what's, like what's kind of the start date in the, in the TN employment letter. So it will kind of like depend on that. But yeah, we generally recommend, especially for Canadians, to kind of not enter more than 10 days. If you are Mexican national, you can kind of apply for the TN visa kind of beforehand, but again, you would need to enter, like not more than 10 days before your employment starts.
Perfect.
We have another question that came up. Are there limits on how long can you be in the US on a TN visa?
There are not any limits. You can renew a TN visa indefinitely as long as you remain eligible for it. There are certain risks that you need to navigate. Like I said before, the longer you're on a TN visa, the more likely it is you'll face questioning about your intention to leave eventually. But there are ways to answer those questions, and based on the law and regulations, there is no limit on the number of times you can renew a TN visa. Of course, there is a limit on how long you can stay in the U.S. You need to comply with your I-94. So, every 3 years, or however long your I-94 is for, you'll either need to leave and come back in, and you can come right back in generally. If it's on a TN, you just want to make sure that you're getting a new I-94 and that they are restarting your period of stay, because it does happen that CBP does not renew your I-94 and you have the same expiration date. So talk with the officer if you're doing that to make sure you get a new I-94. Or you'll need to apply for an extension through USCIS before your I-94 expires.
Perfect. And one last question is there a list of professions that are most in demand for a TN visa? I haven't seen any statistics on this. Have you, Dustin?
No, I haven't. I have not. It's an interesting question. I think, as you just look at the list and just kind of imagine what would be most common. Frankly, I think that some of the tech categories, computer systems analyst, I'm guessing, is quite common. Accountant, economist, engineer. Um, yeah. Um, Other than that, I'm not aware of any statistics, although they may be out there. It's an interesting question.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Justin, for a great presentation, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you,
Thank
Michaela.
you.
Thank you all.
Bye.